In my commentary on the 1776 report, I talked about how leftist historians routinely camouflage the deep complicity of the Democratic Party and the left in slavery, in segregation, in Jim Crow, and racial terrorism, and so on. And this has stirred up a kind of hornet's nest on the left, all these leftist historians screaming and demanding that I produce evidence of textbooks that actually do this. In my commentary, I addressed the Princeton historian Kevin Kruse, who was talking about Martin Luther King and claiming that Martin Luther King was in favor of affirmative action as we now know it, racial preferences. And I said that even though Kruse was able to point to some remarks by King that suggested compensatory justice for the Negro, nevertheless, King did not support a specific race preference policy. Now, Kruse responds to this in the most abusive tone, and he goes things like, Dinesh, you pathetic fool, it's right there in the article. And so I look at the article, and I see, in fact, the quote that I referenced myself about compensatory justice. The sleight of hand that Kevin Kruse is pulling here is to pretend that compensatory justice is affirmative action, that compensatory justice is the same thing as racial preferences. But in fact, they're not the same things at all. Let's look, for example, at Congress's decision to make compensatory payments to Japanese Americans who were interned unjustly in World War II. I can't remember the amount of the payment. It was maybe $15,000, some number. But the point is the payments were made to people who were in the camps and to their immediate families. The payments weren't made just because you were Japanese American. You belonged to a group. In other words, this was not a case of using preferential treatment now to address past discrimination. That is the key meaning of affirmative action. Let's look at how affirmative action actually plays out today. Two guys apply for a job. In the old days, I guess you'd say, the black guy may be better qualified, but the white guy would get the job, and that's racial discrimination. Today, it's the opposite. If the white guy is better qualified, the black guy might still get the job, and that's affirmative action. Now, of course, to any outside observer, you'd see that, far from the first case being corrected by the second, we're talking about 4 different people, all you have are 2 independent cases of racial discrimination. Neither one inherently more legitimate than the other. Whatever the motives, in both cases you're taking a qualified guy and kicking him to the curb and giving an unqualified guy or a less qualified guy the position. That's affirmative action the way it operates today. Today it is the case that if a white or Asian American student who is in the top of their class with 90 percentile SAT scores applies to a college, they could be turned down in favor of a minority Latino African American student who is at the bottom of their class and has mid-level SAT scores. So there's no compensatory justice here at all. The white guy or the Asian guy hasn't wronged the black guy or the Latino. That's not even being alleged. So Martin Luther King's claim that compensatory justice being paid to people who have been victims of harm is totally different than affirmative action as we know it today. But I also think what's striking about all this is the abusive tone that we see from Kruse and a lot of his sidekicks. This whole idea that, Dinesh, you're a complete fool, you're an idiot, you've never taken a history class, you don't know any history, you're a loser, and so on. And I want to sort of address this head on because it's not like me to do a matching of credentials. I never do that. But I think it's important to basically say, who are these guys? What gives them the arrogance to speak in this way? Let's start with Kevin Kruse himself. Kevin Kruse went to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I went to Dartmouth. Dartmouth is an Ivy League college. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is not. I don't think in the history of the University of North Carolina and Chapel Hill there's anyone who has ever gotten into Dartmouth but decided to go to Chapel Hill, even though they have better barbecue over there. Well, Kevin Kruse might say, well, I went on and I I got my graduate degree at Cornell. Well, Cornell is known as the bottom feeder, the dregs of the Ivy League. In the scale of 1 to 8, it's clearly number 8. And you can sort of get the measure of Cornell by the idea that they have at Cornell, and they're the only Ivy League school to have this, they have a hotel school. You can literally take courses on how to be a busboy. You can write your thesis on the history of the taco. I mean, that's Cornell. Kevin Kruse has gone on to write some books. Well, I've written almost 20. He's written almost 3. My books have sold, I would say, millions. His books have sold, I would say, tens. He sold tens of books, mainly probably by forcing his students to buy them. Then you might say, well, wait a minute. He's an acclaimed historian, Dinesh, and you're not. Oh, really? Well, let's compare. My work has been praised by 3 of the greatest historians of the last 50 years. My book, Illiberal Education, was reviewed in the New York Review of Books on the cover by C. Van Woodward, the Yale historian, author of The Strange Career of Jim Crow. 2 of my books were blurbed by Eugene Genovese, widely considered the greatest living scholar, well, no longer living, the late Eugene Genovese, of slavery, but while he lived. My book, The End of Racism, was reviewed by George Fredrickson, the Marxist scholar at Stanford, again considered one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century. Now, what about Kruse? I have here a copy of Kruse's book, White Flight. I look in the back. The first blurb is by Ronald Brownstein, who's not a historian at all. In fact, he's a journalist who's written books denouncing the Republican Party, the usual kind of tripe you get from this kind of journalist. I look down the list, I see a blurb by a guy named Clay Risen. And I thought, where does this guy teach history? Well, it turns out he's a New York Times journalist, and according to his own bio, Clay Risen is a deputy editor of the New York Times and one of the country's leading authorities on whiskey and other spirits. Clay Risen is the author of a book called Whiskey, Bourbon, and Rye. He probably wrote this review under the influence of alcohol. So the point I want to make is, and it's a point that Trump has really made, when Trump gave his speech where he talked about who are the real elite. These guys like Kevin Kruse and all his sidekicks, these people went to second-rate schools, they published nothing, yet they go around preening as if they are the cat's meow, they are the cultural elite of society, even though by every measure, education, reading, breadth of learning, capacity for debate, financial success, by every measure, we have it over them. And so normally I'd let the matter go and focus on the issues, but these are guys who are constantly parading their credentials. And what I want to say is that when you look more closely, you realize that behind all this strutting and preening, what you see is hollow men hiding behind a facade.